Welcome to the PKU Life podcast with Kevin Alexander. Today is January 1st, 2019. Happy New Year! It's hard to believe it's 2019, but here we are. And today's show is a special one. My guest today is KC Singletary. KC and her son Will were the very first people I met in the PKU community, apart from my metabolic team at Tulane Medical Center. We met at a clinic visit years ago, and I interviewed them for my video, My PKU Life. Anytime I interview a parent of a child with PKU, I always ask them about their diagnosis story. The fear and uncertainty is something all parents relate to. We cover a lot of ground in this interview, but I think her advice for new parents is going to be particularly helpful for those who are new to our community and are struggling with this new lifestyle. So, PKU community, meet KC Singletary. KC, first of all, I just want to say thank you very much for being the first guest on the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Kevin. I'm pretty excited about being famous.
So let's just kind of just briefly take a step back and just kind of tell the audience kind of how we met, because I think I've told you this a few times, but you and Will were the very first people I met in the PKU community other than our metabolic team at Tulane. So as a brief backstory, we met at a clinic it would have been about 7, 8, 9 years ago now, something like that. And just kind of like a chance encounter in a clinic. And had you met many other people in the PK community up until that point?
No, we really hadn't met too many. I guess when Will was an infant, I made an effort and met a couple families, and we met a few through clinic. We had done maybe one event at the point that we met you, but I think I was more nervous than you were when we met because I'd never met an adult with PKU, and so that was heart-wrenching at best, and certainly brought me comfort after I got to know you, because you're such a well-spoken, educated, and outgoing man. And, it gave me a glimpse into Will's future that I had a hard time reaching on my own, imagining on my own. So, yeah, I think Will was maybe four when we met you. And we were at a clinic in Lafayette, weren't we? Yep, at the health unit in Lafayette, which is where we used to go for clinic to see our metabolic team from Tulane. It was pretty exciting that day, I think, for Will as well. I remember the video and seeing his little face and how excited he was to tell you what he wanted to do when he grew up.
Yeah, so for the audience, just as a brief geography lesson here, the reason why we keep talking about our clinic at Tulane, which if you know is in New Orleans, Louisiana, but we're talking about a city called Lafayette, Louisiana. So that's where Casey was from, kind of the Lafayette area, which is in South Louisiana. And it's kind of a midway point for me because I live in Shreveport, which is up in Northwest Louisiana, and New Orleans is in Southeast Louisiana, the complete diagonal side of the state. And for me, it's like a 5.5 to 6 hour drive to New Orleans. And as a kid, that was my clinic visits. We would, go on a Thursday night and drive all the way down to, say, Baton Rouge and spend the night, and then go into New Orleans the next day, and we'd have our clinic. Then we'd make a weekend out of it in New Orleans. It was an ordeal. It was a big ordeal to go to clinic at the time. But a while back, they started doing these traveling kind of mobile clinics in different health units across the state. And at the time, well, now there still is the one in Lafayette, Louisiana, which is where Casey and I met. And so Casey, just as a brief, we'll kind of get into a little bit more of your story here in a minute, but you said something a minute ago that I found interesting. You said that at the time, you were particularly nervous about meeting someone who was an adult with PKU. And I think, I don't know if most other parents these days kind of go through the same thing, given the access to information that's out there, 10 years, 15 years later, or 13 years later. Mm-hmm. But what was going through your mind, I guess, because I'd never considered how much anxiety that might cause a parent who's never met an adult with PKU before and just really unsure what they're going to see.
Right. So when Will was born, the first thing I did was looked on the internet, and there was no NPKUA had not been formed, our sort of mothership of advocacy in the United States. And there was no real good information out there, or pictures or videos or anything that gave us any more than devastatingly haunting ideas of what PKU in adulthood looked like, because most instances were late diagnosis. So, and I think it's sort of intuitive that you would, as a clinician or as a member of a genetics team, want to introduce new parents to people who have children of similar ages. And so the first meetings that you set up, or the first people you meet, are those with infants and toddlers and young elementary school children, because you have the most in common. These are your comrades who are going to be going through the same things that you're going through at that time. And I think it's important now that we have such a larger network, and certainly social media lets us do that, for us to connect the adults, same gender and opposite gender adults with the disorder, to the new parents, so that they can see what successful life and well-managed care and self-advocacy looks like. Because the thought of my newborn advocating for himself with this disorder is sort of a cloudy space that was hard to navigate when Will was little, even when he was a early school age, 4, 5, 6. The thought of handing those reins over to someone else to manage, much less him taking over the transition to self-care, was not anything that I could even fathom. So meeting you made me realize that, wow, I remember asking you, how did you do this? And you said, my mom was a warrior. She did such a great job all of my young life, and now I just handle it on my own. I remember thinking, God, I really need to meet your mom.
Yeah, it's funny because it's until I started getting active in the PK community, it's just never something I really thought about, like my upbringing as it relates to PKU. And, the one thing I look back on it and realize is that my family always took PKU seriously. They always recognized how serious it was. You follow the diet, follow the formula. As I've said before, understanding of that has changed over the years. So, my experience growing up was different than kids today, for example. But that being said, my parents followed what the doctor said. They took it very seriously. But at the same time, they also tried to make sure that I didn't feel left out. That I didn't feel like, oh, that's the PKU kid. It was more of like, okay, let's go somewhere we can all eat. But the focus wasn't let's go there because Kevin can eat there. The focus was let's go somewhere where we can all eat. It was meant to be an inclusive thing. It was meant so that I didn't feel left out, but it was also meant so that everybody else could find something as well. Unfortunately, because of my tolerance being a little bit higher and eating a basic vegetarian diet, that was something I was always able to do. So let's take a few steps back now, and let's kind of talk about your diagnosis story, because I've traveled a lot and interviewed a lot of parents since I kind of got involved in PKU advocacy, doing all these videos with the National PKU Alliance for their Lifting the Limits campaign. I got to interview a lot of parents, and the one thing I've found is that every parent's of a child with PKU, every diagnosis story is remarkable, special, unique, different, whatever it may be. And the one thing I found really interesting about yours, of all things, is, if I'm not mistaken, Will was born in 2005, correct?
Yes.
Right around the time of Hurricane Katrina, right?
Yes. So Will was a Katrina baby.
Yeah. So obviously, you and I have talked about this before. For those in my audience who don't know, I perk up anytime a story about Hurricane Katrina comes about, because I was working in TV news in North Louisiana when Hurricane Katrina happened. And 5 days after the storm, I was in New Orleans, and I was in the area, and I was covering the aftermath of Katrina. And it was just a really surreal experience. So anytime anyone talks about Hurricane Katrina, I listen up. But especially as it relates to PKU. So, Casey, let's just take a step back now and kind of talk about it. Was he born like before, during, after the storm? Like, kind of tell me about that.
Right. So he was born after the storm. We have a unique story because my husband is from New Orleans, and we lived in Opelousas, which was about 2 hours, about 120 miles from the city, and we were not affected by Hurricane Katrina at all. Our weather barely even got gray. But my husband's family had to evacuate. And so we had just moved. Actually, we had just purchased a home and not even moved in. But our home that we were in was not big enough to accommodate our family that was evacuating. So we, in a day, and I was at this point 7.5 months pregnant, 8 months pregnant, we got people to move everything into the new house and welcomed family with open arms. So we had dad, stepdad, stepmom, grandma, uncle, cousin. We had 6 adults, 3 dogs, 2 birds. It was crazy. So they all moved in with us, and we bought every air mattress we could find at the local Target and welcomed everyone in. So when Will was born, we still had some of the aftermath of that. Most of the family had moved out. Let me backtrack to say that Hurricane Rita was on the heels of Hurricane Katrina, and Hurricane Rita actually did cause devastation in our area as well. So that took a little shifting of resources because we lost power and water for a few days. So all of the family had moved on to their next locations, obviously not back to New Orleans yet, when Will was born. And he was born at a local hospital October 17th, and everything went fine. The delivery was absolutely routine, and he was perfectly blonde and healthy, and we had a 21-month-old son at the time. We actually, I got discharged from the hospital, and we were wheeling out to the car when they came running down and said, "Wait a minute, the baby hasn't been discharged." It was such a routine for us, since we already had a baby, that we didn't realize that they hadn't done the newborn screen on Will yet. And I remember saying, "PKU, PK Shmoo, we don't have to do that silly test," as I giggled all the way back up to the nursery. And so we carried him back up to the nursery, and I actually was in the nursery. I know these nurses so well, when they did the little heel stick and the test card and finished everything. And then everybody patted us on the back and sent us back down to the car. So that was the first divine intervention that Will got his newborn screen done that day. So we went home, and it was day 11 when we got the call. And my call came from my pediatrician, and in a small town, you know everyone. My father was part of the medical community when he was here with us. So the pediatrician's a family friend, the obstetrician's a family friend. So we got the call. Will was 11 days old. My husband was already back at work, and my toddler was toddling around. And the first question was, "How's the new baby doing? Is he cranky?" And I was like, "Well, he's not any crankier than the first one. You know, he's a newborn." And he said, "Well, something was a little off on the newborn screen, but it's nothing to worry about. It's, it's just one of those preliminary tests. So we'll just have to do a confirmatory test, but it's PKU, and it's not going to be anything to worry about because it's not going to be a true positive." And that was the pediatrician call. So I immediately started looking up PKU and saw nothing but devastating truths about untreated PKU and uncontrolled PKU. And of course, I couldn't discern one type of PKU from the other. So I didn't know that there was a treated kind and an untreated kind, or an early diagnosis or a late diagnosis. None of that meant anything to me. All I could see were the crazy aberrations that happened with untreated PKU on YouTube. So I canceled all visitors and drew the curtains and waited for the next call. Called my husband and told him he needed to come home because the baby was sick. And none of that meant anything to us, so we just had to wait for the next phone call. Well, the next phone call came from Amy Cunningham, and I called her Dr. Cunningham because I couldn't hear anything after she said, "This is Amy Cunningham with Tulane Genetics." And she is the one who directed me to have a confirmatory test done. Well, we were so panicked about Will being sick that my husband logistically was trying to figure out how to get an ambulance to come and pick up Will, because we knew that we couldn't go to New Orleans by car, and the hospital was underwater. So it took us about 2 hours to realize that it was a simple blood test that could be sent off to a confirmatory lab. But the catch was, the confirmatory lab that had accepted newborn screens from Louisiana was in Baltimore. So now we're on a Friday, and Will's blood has to be drawn by a hospital in Opelousas, Louisiana, and overnighted to a lab in Baltimore, Maryland. Will was one of the first babies in Louisiana who was an impetus for the division of genetics called emergency preparedness. There wasn't much work done on emergency preparedness in Louisiana, really in the South, before these children were born post-Katrina. So somehow, I don't remember, it's pretty much a blur, but somehow my husband got in touch with the lab, the lady who ran the lab in Baltimore, and she promised him that she would be waiting for the sample, and as soon as it arrived, she would run it and call the geneticist immediately. So I remember the wave of emotions as one person after the other called me to tell me not to worry about this test that was being done, because it certainly wouldn't be a true positive. You know, HIPAA protects patient rights, but when you're in a small town like Opelousas, somehow news trickles out beyond where it should. So I had calls from multiple pediatricians about Will's screening test long before I had the confirmatory test in. So I remember sitting at home, no visitors, just Mike and me waiting for that call. And we actually asked Amy if we could start Will on formula, just waiting for the confirmatory test. And we did that. So we'd already gone to pick up some metabolic formula because the fear of poisoning my child with breast milk, because I was nursing, was more than I could bear. So what we did was we started him strictly on metabolic formula until we got the confirmatory test back. And so the next morning we got a call from Dr. Taney, who was the geneticist at the time, letting us know that the confirmatory test did what it was supposed to do and confirmed PKU in our baby Will. So we had started the formula. We were well on our way, but I remember the square inch of carpet that I collapsed upon when I got that call saying that the baby truly did have PKU, because then the journey to understanding had to begin. And like with any diagnosis, the stages of grief are no different. I was just in absolute denial that our baby could have something like this.
And you said it was Amy who actually gave you the call. Is that correct?
Amy gave us the call. Yeah, Amy did.
As a quick brief, point of context, Amy is actually my dietitian as well. And Amy is just absolutely incredible. And, you kind of alluded to it. You talked about PKU, emergency preparedness in, post-Katrina. And, one of these days I'm going to try to have Amy on the podcast because she, I kind of did an article with her a few years ago, and I can't, it's not on my website isn't active anymore, that my old website, and it was gone. But there was this article that she wrote, Q&A, where I kind of talked to her about that story, and it was really fascinating. That's definitely something I want to kind of have on the podcast in the future. But yeah, Amy's incredible. And, let's talk about this for just a second. Transitioning now to kind of, those early days after you've gotten the diagnosis, you started trying to kind of figure out, PKU, and the learning adjustment that happens there, that where, for you as a parent, you had a life before PKU and now you have life after PKU, and it's totally different, and you have to learn how to do things all over again. In that learning process, how important and how crucial do you think it is to have a good, solid working relationship with your metabolic team at your clinic?
Well, it's the only way. And, I remember doing an interview for Tulane for their university magazine, and it boils down to about a month period of time. And I think that's what it took to me to go. A month is the period of time it took for me to go from curled up in my bed thinking that I cannot even open my eyes and face the reality that I've been handed, to feeling like a warrior that can go out and do anything that I need to do, conquer any obstacle for my son so that he can be a success story. And you can't get from point A to point B without a metabolic team pushing you along the way, because they are the tools, they give you the tools that you need to get from denial to, to acceptance and a success story. And what you really need is to be able to just sit back and take a deep breath and realize that you've got the tools that you need, and you've got the advocates that you need to help you find the answers. There are always questions. There are questions every single day, but I find now that I answer more questions than I ask. And that comes from being empowered. And you're empowered when you have access to information. And that initial access to information comes from your metabolic team. Still comes from my metabolic team, but they've given me the confidence to be able to go out and seek that information myself. And now I'm involved in lots of different ways so that I have access to information besides just, bugging them all the time.
So let's just assume for a minute that someone listening to this podcast is maybe a new parent who is either very recently learned of their child's diagnosis, or, relatively recently, maybe it's a couple of months. I think it's hard for people to understand until they see the interaction, with the PK community and a metabolic team, how unique of a relationship it is, because, most relationships with medical professionals, whether it's your primary care doctor, a dentist, whoever it may be, you don't get quite as, you share personal information, obviously it's medical information, but you don't get this personal connection, if you will. It's just a very unique relationship. Would you agree?
I absolutely would agree. It's very, it's very personal because the emotional side of a diagnosis of a chronic disease or a lifelong metabolic condition, takes you places that you never knew that you would have to go, and makes you explore parts of your personality that you might not have to deal with if it was just something less permanent. And so I certainly think that the metabolic team, the relationship with the metabolic team, becomes one that's it's important. I mean, it's personal, it's important, and it's lifelong.
And Will's getting a little older now. I want to be cognizant in my podcast of the fact that I have the audience is diverse in the sense of background experiences. Like, you're a parent of a child with PKU, but there's also going to be maybe teenagers, adults, whoever it may be, who have PKU themselves. So what about, have you noticed as Will has gotten older, have you noticed how he has kind of taken to that relationship with the metabolic team?
Yes. And Will's really shy. I call him my absent-minded professor. He is a gifted in academics. He's just really a neat kid to have a conversation with. He's a little bit shy, but when you get him talking, he speaks like an adult. He doesn't speak like a child. And so it's a little off-putting to kids his age if they're not his close friends. But with adults, he's so relatable, it's almost comical. So to hear him talking to Dr. Anderson, to Hans, or to Amy really makes me chuckle, because he's grown up with them as such advocates for him. And now it's like he's talking to comrades. He just doesn't have any, there are no qualms about sharing any of his concerns or thoughts. But Will's very proud of his PKU. He is, he doesn't have any problem talking about it, and he doesn't have any problem, discussing his diet with people. And I think that I really think that has a lot to do with, the way that we have always talked about it and dealt with it and kept it, not really out front like it's his, the definition of Will is PKU, but it's certainly been something that's been part of our everyday life forever. And so when he, in fact, it's really funny, his favorite T-shirts are ones that one of the PKU moms on one of the social media groups that I'm part of had a fundraiser years ago, and the T-shirt says PKU Strong, sort of like that Boston Strong after the marathon, and just a really cute, well-made T-shirt. So we bought one for him, and then a year later, I bought him another one when he outgrew it. And my husband realized before Christmas that Will was wearing a shirt that was 2 sizes too small that said PKU Strong about once a week. And so for Christmas, he got 3 new PKU Strong T-shirts. And, he doesn't go out talking about PKU, but he wears that to school. And that incites lots of questions, and he's happy to answer them. He eats his own diet in front of other people, and he's happy to be who he is, the way that he is. He shows up, and that's what you get. There are no qualms about being Will. Will is Will.
Awesome. So let's talk about him for a second. So, he's becoming a teenager now. As he's getting older, what are some of the challenges you've, I guess, been facing as a parent? PKU through the life cycle is different for everybody. So is there anything that's been kind of, something you having to overcome now as he's getting a little bit older? Because I know he's involved in the swim team, right? So he's very active.
Yeah. Yes. In fact, he just got the call up today that he's moving up a group in swimming. His brother is in the national group, which is the highest level, national level times. And right below that is national development. And one level below that is called TAGS 1. So basically 2 levels below his brother. And he's only 13 and his brother's in high school. So Will is frog leaping over a certain group into TAGS 1 because he's doing so well in swimming. So he's very excited about that. So yeah, we do have some challenges with a few challenges with Will's diet that come up as he gets bigger. He's always had a moderate tolerance, and now with Kuvan, he's been on Kuvan for quite a few years now. Now with Kuvan, his tolerance is really excellent. He eats 1,000 milligrams a day, or about 20 grams of protein a day from food. And he still drinks Phoenix 2, which is one of the older metabolic formulas, the milk-based metabolic formulas. He has never been interested, does not like Restore. He drinks it when he goes to camp because it looks more normal. He doesn't like any of the sort of Kool-Aid looking beverages, and he's sort of a creature of habit. So he's happy to drink his Phoenix. We're not going to rock that boat too much. And as far as food choices go, one thing that changed between elementary and middle school for Will is that in elementary, we live in a fantastic school district now in Texas, and the school made his lunch. So the cafeteria in elementary school, I called the school district and let them know about PKU, and the lunch director knew what PKU was, already had relationships with Cambrook and a couple other suppliers, and told me that he would do whatever it took to feed Will appropriately. So the cafeteria director at the elementary school would send me her school menu 2 weeks ahead of the start of the month, and I would cross off everything that he couldn't have, substitute things that I thought he would like, even if they weren't anything like they were eating at school that day. And then I'd supply her with 2 grocery lists, one from the local grocery store and one from Cambrook, and she would order it and have everything ready for Will. So they did amazing things for him with his diet. They offered the exact same when he got to middle school, but he refused. And my initial reaction was that Will was just spoiled and he wanted me to do it from home because it was easier. But his dad, my husband, was a little more insightful and said, let me see if I can figure this out, and asked Will what his feelings were. And the feelings that had come up in middle school were that he didn't want to be different. And he was going into a class of 300 sixth graders. And the lunchroom was a big bustle of lots of kids moving in lots of different directions. And he didn't want to be that one kid that had a flag on his head or a X on his chest that said, this is the kid that gets fed separately because he's special. So he wanted to be just another guy. So for that reason, we decided to pack his lunch from home and do that all through 6th grade. Now he's in 7th grade, and he does manage his own lunch at school, but he eats a salad every day because that's what he chooses. And since his tolerance is a little bit higher, he can choose to, eat a bag of pretzels off the shelf and eat a salad, and that's fine for him. As far as his swimming goes, his caloric needs are a little bit higher than everybody else, but the exercise, while not changing his tolerance, it makes his levels, as far as all the research I've done, more even keel. He doesn't have as many fluctuations because he actually has a higher metabolism, and so everything is a little bit smoother for Will, and he doesn't have the ebbs and the ebb and flow of levels and ebb and flow of moods that he might have otherwise. So the exercise does him well. His body is developing at a very rapid rate, so his Kuvan needs have gone up significantly in the past couple months. He can't do protein drinks like his older brother does. He can't do all of those amino acid boosts that those other kids do, but he has an electrolyte mix that he likes called Cytomax that has no protein, lots of calories and electrolytes. And that's what he drinks before he goes to practice every day. In fact, today he has a double. He's getting ready to go back for another 2 hours, and he swam for 2 hours this morning. So he doesn't have any trouble with energy, and he sure doesn't have any trouble with muscle development. He's 13, and he's 5'6", and weighs 142 pounds, so he's a big boy already.
Yeah, well, it's great to hear that Will continues to do very, very well. And I know you guys have moved to Texas, but it was great to see you. I guess it was earlier this year. I guess it was like March or something when we were in New Orleans for that video shoot.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So brief context, I work for a video production company, and we were able to do work with the National PKU Alliance and Brenda Winiarski from Cook for Love. We were able to work on this project to advocate for the Medical Nutrition Equity Act, and we had a shoot for that down at Tulane in New Orleans, and we got to interview Dr. Anderson, we got to interview Amy, and got to see the whole team at Tulane, and got to have some of our other friends from Louisiana come in for the video shoot. So it was really nice to see everybody. Casey, before we go, I did want to talk to you about, because we kind of talked earlier on about your diagnosis story and kind of the early days. because I know that you're active in helping people when whether it's on social media or whatever it may be, helping other parents when they first find out their child has PKU. So if we could just kind of close this out on when you're talking to someone who's just found out, recently that their child has PKU. I mean, from personal experience what's going through their head, and how scary it is at the time. What do you say to them to try to help them out? What advice do you give them?
I think that taking a deep breath, just sit back and breathe, rely on the metabolic team in the very beginning, trust the process. A baby with PKU is truly no different than a baby without PKU, because nutritionally our needs are met through formula or milk, and the metabolic team is ultimately in control of how that is managed. So worrying about what your levels are today versus what they were 2 days ago is not going to change the way that your baby is treated. You don't have to worry about that. You have to worry about enjoying the smiles and the coos, and enjoying the sleepless nights, and enjoying your baby's infant stage. Even in the early foods, the Gerber Nestle company is phenomenal in helping. And so you really are able to enjoy feeding your baby just as if you were feeding your baby without PKU. You're just not feeding the meat foods, but relaxing and enjoying the early stages, because the information comes to you as you need it. As long as you're open to developing that relationship with your metabolic team, they are in place to help you. And now that we have social media and a connection with others around us, it becomes, it truly takes a village. And with a metabolic child, that village is the metabolic community around you. And near and far, there are people who have walked in your shoes. And we have all gotten from fear to acceptance and success. And allowing all of us to support you and help you through those early days really is key to sanity, because you can worry yourself into a place where you don't think that you can emerge, into the light again. And there truly is, accepting the condition and accepting that you're going to have the tools that you need when you need them leads to a place where you have a child like Will, who's 13 and can advocate for himself and enjoys teaching people about his condition. And when you ask Will, what is the best thing about being Will Singletary? He says, PKU is the best thing about being Will Singletary. And that, to me, is a success story in and of itself.
Yeah, I completely agree. I know that there are people out there who have a hard time with PKU, but I completely agree with your attitude that, we can't control the life that we've been given, but we can control how we react to that. And I know that people I have friends who are older than me who had experiences when they were taken off diet at a young age, and it affected their life, and it affected the way they look at life and everything. And I completely understand their experiences that they went through, but at the same time, I think we can help those people from that generation while also recognizing that we should be thankful that we've gotten to a place with our treatment now where kids like Will can grow up today without experiencing any of those troubles. So, yes. Casey, thank you very much for joining me for the first interview for the podcast.
Thank you, Kevin. I look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you for listening to the PKU Life podcast. If you want to connect with me, I'm on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Links are in the show notes. I'll be back in a few weeks with another interview. I'll see you next time.